The year was 1267. 4 years had passed since the Nordlings, aided by the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, triumphed over the Nilfgaardian Empire at Sodden Hill. A truce had been established between the belligerent nations, but tension lingered. Sintra was still occupied, and the Black Ones still remained ominously on the other side of the Yaruga, for Emhyr va Emreis had not given up on his expansionist ambitions. Welcome to our second video on the world of The Witcher. This time, Wizards and Warriors will chronicle the Second Northern War and the Battle of Brenna. Storytelling is not science, but there is a way to learn how to be a better storyteller, and today's sponsor Blinkist would like to help you with that. A Blinkist subscription is something that you've got to have if you want to be more knowledgeable in 2022 and beyond. Blinkist is all about preserving and sharing knowledge by making it easily digestible even for the busiest among us. This platform takes the most interesting and relevant non-fiction books and turns them into 15-minute audios, blinks. More than 3,000 titles are already available, which means that you can learn on the go, learn fast, and always improve your knowledge no matter how time-constrained you are. If you want to improve your storytelling chops, we highly recommend The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr if you want to learn to craft compelling stories using psychology and neuroscience. While Lisa Cron's Wired for Story is for anyone interested in writing, as it explains why some stories suck us in and keep us engaged. Imagine learning the most important things from these two books in under 30 minutes, and Blinkist has much more, with new titles added all the time. Support our channel and your growth. Get yourself premium access to knowledge. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Click the link in the description or go to blinkist.com/wizardsandwarriors to start your free 7-day trial with Blinkist and get 25% off premium membership. It is ugly, indeed, but the lion cub, if she has survived, must now die, for reasons of state. Gentlemen. The rain hammered against the windows, the gale howled among the towers of Haggard Castle, the kings grew silent. Blood of Elves, Chapter 7. In the years since their defeat at Sodden, Nilfgaardian agents prepared for the next invasion by fomenting division amongst their foes. In hamlets and towns, rumours began to spread that in the lands recently conquered by the Empire, everybody lived freer and richer lives. Preachers roamed from Vizima to Tretigor, delivering firebrand sermons of a saviour destined to come from the south. Incited by the Imperials, armed scoia'tael partisans continued to paralyse trade and terrorise poor farmers in their undefended villages. In Haggard Castle, a secret council was held between Vizimir of Redania, Foltest of Temeria, Dermowend of Aedirn, Henselt of Kaedwen, and Meve of Lyria. There they decided that special forces were to be established to hunt the scoia'tael down in their forests and leave their corpses as a warning to other non-humans. Meanwhile, it was an open secret that after Sodden, Emhyr had violently purged the old military aristocracy, replacing them with young and talented commanders who sought nothing more than a chance to avenge that defeat. Thus, the northern monarchs agreed that it would have to be them who would make the first strike, and that it should be directed at Sintra. This, however, would violate the ongoing truce, and if the 5 monarchs were seen as aggressors, then other northern realms would not join them in war, nor would the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, who had been so crucial in the First Northern War. So it was decided that the Edenians would stage a false flag assault on the fort of Dol Angra, located in Lyria, to make it look like Nilfgaard had attacked, and therefore increase support for a war against the Empire. That left the other issue, the heiress of Sintra. Cirilla was still missing, and the monarchs knew full well that if Emhyr could find and marry her, then he could legitimize his claim to Sintra. To prevent that, Cirilla had to be found and eliminated. Unbeknownst to the northern monarchs, word of their meeting reached Emhyr himself. The emperor easily predicted the plan to use Dol Angra to bait him into conflict, so he sent Menno Cohorn to garrison the region and stand by. Then, as part of his plan to destroy the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, Emhyr instructed his agents to spread the information about the Haggard Council to the northern mages. Nature doesn't know the concept of philosophy, Geralt of Rivia. The pathetic, ridiculous attempts which people undertake to try and understand nature are typically termed philosophy. The results of such attempts are also considered philosophy. It's as though a cabbage tried to investigate the causes and effects of its existence, called the result of these reflections an eternal and mysterious conflict between head and root, and considered rain an unfathomable causative power. We sorcerers don't waste time puzzling out what nature is. We know what it is, for we are nature ourselves. Do you understand? I'm trying to, but please speak more slowly. Don't forget, you're talking to a cabbage. Vilgefortz of Rugavine and Geralt of Rivia, Time of Contempt, Chapter 3. The Northern mages, who considered the monarchs their puppets, were incensed that they had begun to scheme independently. To discuss their seemingly waning influence, the Brotherhood called for a grand conclave to be held at the palace on Thanet Island, home of Aretuza, the foremost school for young sorceresses. This extravagant banquet was attended by the most influential magicians throughout the Northern Realms, including Philippa Eilhart, Kira Metz, Triss Merigold, Yennefer of Vengerberg, the head mistress of Aretuza, Tisea de Vries, one of the last elven sages, Enid Angliena, and the enigmatic Vilgefortz. Several non-magical notables also attended, such as Sigismund Dijkstra, Spymaster of Redania, and Geralt of Rivia, a renowned witcher. The guests exchanged pleasantries and dined on delicacies, but beneath this veneer of civility, lines were being drawn in the sand. Through bribery and subterfuge, Emperor Emhyr had divided the Brotherhood. Vilgefortz, who had led the mages at Sodden, was still secretly in Emhyr's employ. So was Enid Angliena, who had been promised to be made queen of a free elven kingdom. By the Emperor's design, the Northern mages were all gathered in one place, and his agents were ready to burn their organization down from within. But the other wizards, still loyal to the Northern kings, soon caught on to this imperial subterfuge, and after the banquet, things went south. Philippa Eilhart made the first move. With the help of Spymaster Dijkstra and his Redanian troops, she had all mages suspected of conspiring with Nilfgaard arrested and brought to Garstang, the tower on Thanet with a magical barrier, preventing all spells from being cast. Tisea de Vries, who had remained neutral, demanded to know the meaning of all this. Her questions were answered when Yennefer entered Garstang with a mysterious white-haired augur in tow. In a trance, the medium spoke. Last night, armed forces in Lyrian livery and carrying Aedirnian standards committed acts of aggression against the Empire of Nilfgaard. Glavitzingen, a border outpost in Dol Angra, was attacked. King Demoven's heralds informed the people of the surrounding villages that Aedirn is taking control of the entire country from today. The entire population was incited to rise up against Nilfgaard. Following this dizzying revelation, chaos and arguing had erupted between the mages, but the child continued. King Vizimir was murdered yesterday evening, stabbed by an assassin. Redania no longer has a king. By now, Tisea de Vries had made up her mind. Seeing the Northern-aligned mages as unjustified aggressors and instigators of the coup, she took down the magic barrier over Garstang and freed the Nilfgaard supporters. A huge mistake, for Enid immediately bolted for the cellars, opening its doors to reveal she had smuggled a unit of scoia'tael warriors into Thanet. Elven guerrillas poured into the mages' palace and began massacring Northern sorcerers. Vilgefortz too sprang into action, cutting down his foes. The Northern mages fought back, and soon chaos reigned over Thanet. The fight itself had been a stalemate. Nevertheless, the Brotherhood of Sorcerers had been ripped apart. The Second Northern War had begun. War to the castles, peace to the villages, Cohorn said to his commanders yesterday. You know that principle, he added at once. You learned it in officer training. That principle applied until today. From tomorrow, you're to forget it. From tomorrow, a different principle applies, which will be the battle cry of the war we are waging. War on everything alive. War on everything that can burn. Field Marshal Menno Cohorn. The Time of Contempt, Chapter 5. The Emperor struck while the iron was hot. After the Aedirnian advance into Glavitzingen gave them the casus belli they required, The huge Nilfgaardian garrison at Dol Angra was ordered to retaliate at once. In the summer of 1267, 13,000 men, led by Field Marshal Menno Cohorn, advanced into Lyria. The border fortresses of Spala and Scala fell almost immediately. The banners of the Black Sun then advanced upon the small kingdom of Rivia, where the lion-hearted Queen Meve held up in the capital city, prepared to withstand months of siege. However, the merchants and guilds of Rivia had been promised by imperial envoys that if they surrendered, their city would not be sacked. Thus, Rivia was handed bloodlessly into Nilfgaardian hands. Betrayed, Queen Meve took any men who would follow her and retreated north to join forces with King Dermawend and the Aedirnian army. They made their stand at the city of Aldisburg, having mustered 10,000 levies and 3,000 heavy cavalry between them. It would not be enough, for the Aedirnian Lyrian force was crushed. Aldisburg fell into imperial control, and Vengerberg, the capital of Aedirn, would follow suit a week later. King Dermawend escaped to Redania, while Meve would disappear into the woods with whatever loyal men she had left. Thousands of refugees fled for the Redanian border, but they were either hunted down and enslaved by the Black Ones, or cut down by the scoia'tael, who were now working directly with the Imperials in the name of non-human freedom. Lyria, Rivia and Aedirn had fallen, but help was nowhere to be seen. The northern realms, who had been so united at Sodden Hill just 4 years earlier, were now divided and in disarray. Redania was engulfed in internal turmoil after the death of King Vizimir, whose demise had come at the hands of an assassin controlled by Vilgefortz. Since then, Spymaster Dijkstra had more or less become the kingdom's de facto leader, but was occupied dealing with the scoia'tael commandos and Nilfgaardian spies wreaking havoc in his realm, rendering him unable to come to Lyria and Aedern's aid. Temeria would be of no help either. Just as Imperial forces were about to take Vengerberg, a Nilfgaardian envoy arrived in Vizima, offering Foltest a truce. Fearing that his own kingdom would share Aedern's fate, the king agreed and took Temeria out of the war. In the meantime, King Erval of Verden had committed to Nilfgaardian vassalage. As for Cadwyn, King Hanselt had come to an agreement with Emperor Emhyr to partition the now moribund Aedern between them. Thus, instead of bringing war to the enemy, the Cadweni Dunbanner marched upon their Nordling kinsmen, occupying Aedern north of the River Dyfna, while Nilfgaard occupied the south. Finally, what remained of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers would predictably be of no help. Many of them had died on Thanid, while those who lived had fallen out of favour of the kings they once influenced. It was now very evident that there would be no second Sodden Hill. While all this was happening, Emperor Emhyr had honoured his promise to Enid Angliana, establishing an independent elven state in Dol Blathanna. After 100 years of human occupation, the elves had finally reclaimed their ancestral Valley of Flowers. But there was a price to pay. As per her agreement with Nilfgaard, the elven youth serving in the scoia'tael commandos had to stay behind enemy lines and continue to cause chaos in the northern realms. Thus, while Queen Enid ruled over a valley of infertile elders, the future of her race bled and died at the end of Nordling's spears. Promptly breaking his truce with Foltest, Emhyr ordered Cohorn's column to march into the Temerian protectorates of Brugger and Lower Sodden. Then, after taking the forts of Mienna and Resdan on the inner river, the Nilfgaardian army struck north at the city of Maribor. There, they crushed an army led by the Temerian king outside the city walls, but the city itself held out. By playing the coward and signing a truce with Emhyr, Foltest had bought himself a whopping 2 weeks of peace, 16 days to be exact. Nevertheless, his hide was temporarily saved by the turning of the seasons. Winter was approaching, and the Nilfgaardian supply lines were overstretched. Thus, Cohorn was forced to pull his forces back to Sodden and wait until spring for the next offensive. During the brief reprieve in fighting, Spymaster Dijkstra had somewhat stabilized Redania and took a sojourn to the kingdom of Kovir to look for allies. Kovir's king, the tall and handsome Esterad Thiessen, was nominally at peace with Nilfgaard. Nevertheless, he was sympathetic to the Redanian plight. So after meeting with Dijkstra, he devised a plan to help his fellow Nordlings without breaking his neutrality pact. King Thucent mysteriously offered a mass royal pardon for all the criminals in his dungeons, while the Redanian treasury simultaneously received a mysterious donation of gold from a Nilfgaardian merchant, gold that was used to hire an army of hardened mercenary brigands. The Free Company, as it would be called, would bolster Redania's numbers in the battles to come. Surprisingly, the Nordlings would also find reinforcements provided to them by Bruva Hug, the Dwarven elder of Mahakam. These stout bearded warriors condemned the actions of their brethren in the scoia'tael and were eager to beat back the wrath of Nilfgaardian tyranny. Commanded by the likes of Barclay Els, Sheldon Skaggs and Sultan Chive, the Mahakaman volunteers would see battle soon enough. Meanwhile, back in the Nilfgaardian heartland, the war was becoming deeply unpopular, both among the merchants and aristocrats. Secret factions had begun forming against the emperor, with the noblemen Arb Paninken and Joachim de Wet among the most prominent conspirators. Naturally, Emir learned of this and in response placed his two political enemies in commanding roles on the front lines of battle, far away from the imperial capital. This may have protected him from conspiracy, but it made the loyalty and competency of his generals highly questionable. When the spring of 1268 came, the total war would begin again in earnest, and this time the Nilfgaardians would bring the full brunt of their imperial might to bear. The spring offensive was divided into three prongs. The centre group, led by Menno Cohorn, would fight their way to the Pontar, taking Vizima and Novigrad. The eastern unit, led by the conspirator Arb Paninken, would strike Kedwin from occupied Edirne, predictably breaking the truce with King Henselt, just as they had with Foltest. Finally, the western prong, led by the other conspirator Joachim de Wet, was to hug the western coast and take Sideris. All told, each prong numbered around 100,000 soldiers, amounting to over 300,000 invaders in total. Despite all this, none of Nilfgaard's battle plans would come to pass, and it is here that the war slowly began to turn in the North's favour. In the east, Arb Paninken's advance was stalled by insurgent campaigns that sprung up across Nilfgaardian-occupied territory. In Lyria, Queen Meve, who had never surrendered or been captured, was leading a guerrilla campaign against the occupiers. Making a strike at Angren, her partisans clashed with an imperial army on the Yaruga River over Red Labinden Bridge. There, Meve scored a great victory, inadvertently aided by a certain Geralt of Rivia and his companions, who just happened to be in the neighbourhood. For his heroics, Geralt was knighted and granted an honoured position in the Queen's retinue. Yet the White Wolf deserted her soon after, for he was on a secret mission of his own. In any case, the war continued. Where the eastern prong was merely stalled, the western prong was a total disaster. Instead of invading Sideris like he was supposed to, Joachim de Wet insisted on keeping his army in Verden and putting down the sparse rebel groups in the region. To that end, his soldiers committed mass atrocities against Verden's civilians. Originally there had been some 500 rebels in all of Verden. By the time Joachim was done, the whole country had risen up against him. Ervil, the king who had willingly submitted to Nilfgaardian rule, was assassinated and replaced by his son Kistrin, who became the face of the resistance. He was soon joined by the Jarl of Skellige, Kraken Crate, and King Ithane of Sidaris. Together, the Verdanians, Siderians and Skellige Sea Dogs slowly began pushing the Nilfgaardian Western Army back to the Yaruga. De Wet's floundering proved to be a massive blow to the Empire, as the aura of invincibility that loomed over the Black Ones was shattered, inspiring the kings of the north to go on the offensive and retake the lands that had been lost. From Vizima, the armies of Temeria and Redania joined forces and pushed upon Menno Cohorn's centre army group. Marching south, they broke the imperial siege of Maribor, and at the fortress of Miena, the Nordlings gained a decisive triumph, due heavily in part to the Kaviri-funded Free Company. Slowly but surely, the Nordlings pushed Menno Cohorn further and further south, but their advance was forced to retreat to Vizima after Cohorn launched a massive counter-assault to retake Miena. Nevertheless, momentum was still on the north side. Henselt of Cadwin had rallied his armies and moved to join the Temerian and Redanian campaign, and he was joined by the remnants of the Edirnian armed forces. It was time for one final climactic showdown, and that showdown would come on the plains of Brenna. Ho ho ho! Don't wait, don't be hasty, things will very soon get tasty. This shambles will fall apart, shaken to its very heart. Ho ho ho! Dwarven war cries at the Battle of Brenna, Lady of the Lake, Chapter 8. Upon realizing that the Nordlings were amassing a large army in Vizima, Field Marshal Cohorn immediately began a drive northwards. He still commanded nearly 100,000 men, but he had left half his troops behind, taking with him mostly cavalry units so as to travel faster. Meanwhile, a united force of Temerians and Redanians, led by King Foltest of Temeria and his chief constable, John Natalis, marched south from Vizima. The two armies met on the banks of the Chotla River, near the burnt-out husk of a fishing village called Brenna. Without delay, the Nordlings formed their lines. The left flank was composed of the Royal Corps of Temeria and Redania, consisting of 8,000 professional soldiers, both mounted and on foot. In the centre, 12,000 regular foot soldiers of both kingdoms formed two main lines, protected on the flanks by 10 units of heavy cavalry. Behind them was the poor infantry, a ragged band of inexperienced farmhands, fishermen, and other peasant volunteers. The right wing was most diverse, comprising 8 divisions of light cavalry from Brugge, the stalwart Dwarven volunteers of Mahakam, and the wild and rowdy Free Company of Kovir. Volunteers from Sintra and Skellige were also sprinkled among them. On the other end of the field, Field Marshal Cohorn had arrived with all the mounted divisions of the Nilfgaardian 3rd and 4th armies. He organised them into an arc, with the 3rd army, consisting of the Ardfean, Daithwen and Alba divisions, took up the left, while the 4th army, consisting of the divisions of Nausicaa, Venendel, Magna and Frunsburg, the brigades of Vicovaro and Derlin, took up the right. Meanwhile, the Vrihed Brigade, composed entirely of the elite elven warriors of the scoia'tael, stood behind the centre in reserve. All in all, the Black Sun flew over a host of 46,000 men, while the Temerian Lilies and Redanian Eagle over barely 25,000. The north was direly outnumbered. Hours passed and the two sides only stared each other down. Despite having the advantage, Cohorn did not order an advance, for he was waiting on a report from his scouts. He had no eyes on the hill that crested to the north of the battlefield, and needed to make sure he would not be flanked before committing to battle. Sure enough, his lead scout, Lamar Flout, soon returned, informing Cohorn that there was nothing beyond the hills. Thus the battle was joined. Cohorn ordered the Alba division forward, and the cream of the Nilfgaardian mounted corps thundered down the centre of the battlefield, smashing into the Nordling centre to devastating effect. The Alba knights cut a bloody swath through the Temerian and Redanian infantry, but were unable to break through entirely and became stuck in a mass of mud, blood and bodies. The northern infantry fought back, pulling riders off their mounts or impaling them with pikes. By now, the Temerian heavy cavalry had leapt into the fray, circling around the flanks and devastating the Alba from behind. While all this transpired, the Venendal and Magna divisions had stampeded into the Nordling left, but the Royal Corps, made up of the finest halberdiers and Landsknecht in the north, held firm. On the left and the centre, the field was tilted in the Nordlings' favour, but on the right they were losing ground. There, the Daithwen and Ardfein divisions had clashed with the light cavalry of Brugge, and the Bruggians were quickly being overwhelmed. However, the disreputable brigands of the Free Company quickly rode into the fray and temporarily pushed the enemy back. This, however, had left their left flank exposed, allowing both the Free Company and the Dwarves of Mahakam to become surrounded. Realizing the right wing was about to be entirely isolated, Constable John Natalis gave them the signal to retreat. A tall order, given that they were now entirely encircled. Here, the valour of the Dwarves was shown. Forming up into a tight and impenetrable square formation, the stout warriors endured wave upon wave of assault upon their shields, but with the help of the Free Company, they broke through and rejoined the rest of the Nordling army. In response to this, Cohorn activated the elves of Rihed, ordering them to cleave a wedge through the northern front before the dwarves could rejoin them. The elves succeeded, smashing through the front lines and tried to spread panic by attacking the field hospitals behind the battle lines. However, King Foltest kept his nerve and sent in his second line of infantry, which engaged the elves and brought them into a stalemate. Suddenly, over the very same hill that Cohorn's scout had reported there was nothing beyond, 10,000 Redanian, Edirnian and Kaedweni heavy cavalry came barreling onto the battlefield. What remained of Vynendal and Magna broke their engagement with the Nordling left and turned north to face down these reinforcements, but this exposed their flank, and the Royal Corps launched a suicidal attack on them from behind, allowing the relief force to annihilate them. Now compelled into a desperate Hail Mary, Field Marshal Cohorn sent his last and most elite units, the Deerlan and Nausicaa, into the breach created by the Vrihed elves in a final attempt to break the northern line. But before they could reach the opening, the poor infantry filled in the gap, and despite only being little more than a peasant mob, surprisingly were able to hold out against the cream of the Nilfgaardian army. The battle had turned into a rout. On the left, the Nordlings' relief cavalry had driven the Black Ones into retreat, while on the right, the dwarves had made mincemeat of their foes. Seeing the situation as utterly hopeless, Cohorn disguised himself as a low-ranking soldier, jumped on a horse provided to him by an officer, and attempted to flee. To no avail, for he was stopped in his tracks by the Mahakaman volunteers and was struck down by none other than Zoltan Chive. The Battle of Brenna was over. 44,000 Black Ones lay dead, and the North had won a decisive victory. After their defeat at Brenna, the spine of the Nilfgaardian advance had been broken, and the armies of the North began rapidly pushing them back to the Aruga. Constable John Natalis quickly advanced south, annihilating the Imperial infantry that Cohorn had not taken to Brenna with him. He then stabbed west, liberating Brugge from Nilfgaardian control. Meanwhile, Joachim de Wet, still struggling against the Sidarians and Verdun guerrillas, soon realized Natalis was coming for him and retreated south to Sintra, where he garrisoned the fortresses of Nestrog, Rosrog and Bodrog and held up there like a turtle. In the east, King Dermawend had forgiven King Henselt for his erstwhile trespasses on Edirnian property, and thus Edirn and Kaedwen joined forces and chased Adel ep Dahi's eastern army southwards. They were soon joined by Queen Meve and her guerrillas. Ep Dahi retreated until he reached Vengerberg, where he intended to make a final stand, but there he mysteriously fell ill and died. Now headless, the Nilfgaardian eastern group collapsed, and Edirn, Lyria and Rivia were promptly liberated. By now, the wartime borders had more or less reached the status quo antebellum. However, by now public opinion on both sides had turned decisively against the conflict. The North was tempted to try to retake Sintra, but was unwilling to risk the thousands of lives they would inevitably lose by assaulting Nastrog, Rosrog and Bodrog, the forts that guarded its border. Meanwhile, in Nilfgaard, the merchant corporations and nobility were at Emperor Amir's throat, tired of funding his endless wars. Thus, after nearly 2 years of total war, a truce was declared between the Empire and the Nordlings. "The end justifies the means," Emir said dully. "What I'm doing for posterity, to save the world. If the world is to be saved like that," the Witcher lifted his head, "it would be better for it to perish. Believe me, Dunny, it'd be better if it perished." Lady of the Lake, Chapter 9. In April of 1268, the kings and queens of the north met in Sintra with Nilfgaardian ambassador Shillard Fitzosterlen and signed a binding treaty that would become known as the Peace of Sintra. It would be the Anshe who would suffer the most from this treaty, as to appease the northern monarchs, Nilfgaard sold out their elven allies, leaving the scoia'tael units in the north abandoned to be picked off one by one. Meanwhile, Dol Blathanna would be absorbed back into Edirn, albeit now as an autonomous elven polity. As for the northern realms, they had their sovereignty guaranteed, but their lands had been devastated, their farmlands and industry crippled. Domestically, the empire was in much better shape than their former enemies, enabling Nilfgaard to conquer with goods and gold what they could not with spears. Sintra, meanwhile, would become a part of the empire. During the course of the war, the missing Princess Cirilla had been found and wed to Emperor Amir, securing his dynastic claim on the kingdom. Of course, rumours abounded that this girl was not, in fact, the real Cirilla, but an imposter. But those were probably just rumours. Finally, although this piece was ostensibly composed by kings and queens, the reality was not as it seemed. While the Brotherhood of Sorcerers was in ashes after Thanedd, a new order, the Lodge of Sorceresses, composed exclusively of female wizards, had risen in its place. Intelligent and extremely ambitious Kiera Metz, Triss Merigold and Philippa Eilhart wormed their way back into the good graces of the Northern Kings, whom they would control from the shadows. Overall, it seemed that for now there would be peace on the continent, but who knew what the future would bring? We hope that you enjoyed our mini-series on the worlds of The Witcher. We're planning to cover battles of all major fantasy, sci-fi and alternative history worlds, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing. This goes a long way to help us in the eyes of the almighty algorithm. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to see what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. Your feedback is very important to us. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.